transformed these countries into unbending allies of the United States of America.
You're listening to the Corbett Report.
For the past several weeks, NATO has been conducting a full-scale military exercise with 31,000 service members from 24 nations in Poland. Dubbed Anaconda 16, the exercise aims to train, exercise, and integrate Polish national command and force structures into an allied joint multinational environment as part of NATO's stated goal of creating a rapidly deployable global strike force.
We are in northern Poland. We're out here to conduct several training events with our NATO allies. We've been out here for several weeks on different exercises, but all basically aiming at the same objective, which is to prove our deployability as a unit, to show that we are strong NATO allies, can be relied upon by our NATO partners, and also to make the most of the sort of training facilities that we have here that we don't necessarily have everywhere in the UK.
Taking place as it is on Russia's doorstep in Eastern Europe, it is not without some irony that Anaconda 16 coincides with the 75th anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, Nazi Germany's ill-fated invasion of the Soviet Union that began on the 22nd of June 1941. Although Anaconda 16 is no doubt part of a greater pattern of NATO aggression and provocation aimed at Russia, as Michel Chossudovsky of the Center for Research on Globalization explains, it is not likely that NATO is planning a conventional military attack on Russia's doorstep via Eastern Europe.
Well, first of all, I think we have to understand that war preparations are invariably based on deceit and the use of intelligence. And if you want to wage a war, you don't simply put it up headlines on all the newspapers all over the world. So that this deployment, of course, is very, very dangerous. I'm talking about Anaconda 16. But it is much more of a propaganda exercise as well as orchestrated threat against Russia, which has much broader implications because it's also intended to weaken Russia strategically, economically, but it's also intended to send a message to Russia with regard to its deployments in other regions of the world, namely the Middle East. And it also has implications with regard to Russia's alliances with regard to other countries, but specifically with regard to China. Now, what I should mention, and I think it's very important that people remember this, 75 years ago, on the 22nd of June, 1941, Operation Barbarossa was launched by Nazi Germany. And it was a surprise operation. It had been prepared well in advance. It started preparation on December the 10th, half a year before it was actually launched. And the Russians had some intelligence with regard to this operation, but ultimately they did not act, and they were taken by surprise when the Germans started to deploy military hardware on Russia's border. And what I'm suggesting is that the United States has had war plans to invade Russia and previously the Soviet Union for more than 30 years, certainly more than 30 years. And it's a routine exercise which is repeated on an annual basis, and it's also there to intimidate a potential enemy. And what I think we have to look at is the broader implications. At the time when Nazi Germany launched its war on Russia, or prior to that, they had very good relations. They had trade. They had a non-aggression pact. And this is not the scenario which we are now seeing in Eastern Europe, with the deployment of NATO troops at Russia's border. So what I'm saying is that this is not how you wage, at least World War III, if we're going to talk about World War III. World War III will not happen in Eastern Europe. It is much more likely to happen in the Middle East. And what I think is involved, and this has been something which has been on the drawing board of the Pentagon for more than 10 years, is the next step of this war is Iran. As one says, the road to Tehran goes through Damascus, so that the war in Syria is absolutely fundamental in understanding the dynamics of the Middle East war, but also East-West confrontations and Russia's involvement in that Middle East war.
So I think that's a clear enough line from the aggression that we see outwardly in Eastern Europe being used as a distraction from some of the real prizes that are happening in the Middle East. But as you go even further in a talk that you gave recently at the National Autonomous University of Nicaragua, where you were receiving a doctor honoris causa in the humanities, you gave a talk in which you laid out a much wider agenda for this American hegemon that isn't just aimed at Russia and isn't just centered on Middle East, but is really global in its scope. Can you tell us about the outlines of that all-out global war that is taking place right now?
Well, first of all, I think that conventional warfare, deploying tanks and armored cars and even missiles, is only one component of this global military agenda. And it's much more likely that global warfare will be using, and it is using, what we call non-conventional instruments. We have the destabilization of sovereign governments using so-called regime change, which are intelligence ops, the intelligence operations. We have the use of insurgencies, the triggering of civil wars. We know that Al-Qaeda and ISIS are CIA constructs going back to the Soviet-Afghan war, starting in 1979. But nonetheless, this has become a cornerstone of U.S. military doctrine, going after the terrorists, waging humanitarian wars, facilitating the transition from national governments to U.S. proxies in the name of democracy. And it's happening everywhere. It's happening in Latin America, where we don't see any kind of conventional military deployments taking place. And in sub-Saharan Africa, it's largely the role of affiliates of Al-Qaeda, such as Boko Haram, or Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb or in the Arabian Peninsula. These entities are used under the surveillance of Western intelligence to destabilize, systematically destabilize sovereign governments. And then you have also the use of what we might call financial warfare, where you trigger the collapse of the oil market. It's something which is complex to understand, but those are the instruments of financial speculation. You can also trigger the collapse of currencies, as occurred during the Asian crisis, but has occurred subsequently. And if you want to target your enemy, you don't necessarily go in with tanks. You start undermining its communication systems, its national economy, its institutions, and ultimately the objective, this is a hegemonic objective, is to transform countries into territories where they don't have any institutions, they don't have any government which is functioning, they don't have monetary policy, that's very important, so they can't finance their development, and so on and so forth. That is the nature of this global agenda. And in a sense, neoliberalism and militarism are intertwined. War is ultimately an economic process, and at the same time, the economic process is sustaining the military agenda.
It is in some ways quite easy to identify the enemy of the hegemon by identifying the countries that are going through this upheaval that you're talking about, but it is perhaps more valuable to identify the hegemon itself, because it is too easy to say simply the United States, as if this is some sort of monolithic entity. Obviously, this is a combination of governmental power, but also corporate power. How do you identify the root of this hegemon that's waging this war?
Well, there is definitely a US-led military agenda And there is also the dominance of what we might call the Anglo-American, banking system. I think those are central. There's also big pharma, there's the military-industrial complex, and so on. But I think what is important there is to underscore the fact that military as well as economic agendas are based on structures of alliance. And, NATO is a military alliance of 28 countries. It's dominated by the Pentagon. Okay? The Pentagon calls the shots. So, in other words, the member states are subservient. And in many of these member states, there's opposition to NATO. But the thing is much broader. You go to Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, all of which are victims of US-led wars in one form or another. The Vietnamese are part of a military alliance with the United States. And, of course, Japan, Korea, the same, former victims of US-led wars or US-led interventions. And ultimately, what the United States has built as part of its hegemonic project is to, first of all, to conquer these countries. And historically, that's what happened, or establish a sphere of influence, and then transform these countries into unbending allies of the United States of America, which in effect also undermines their sovereignty from the economic as well as from the military standpoint. And so you have Vietnam is a country which is a cheap labor haven for producing commodities for Western markets. The same is true in Cambodia, and so on and so forth. And what I'm suggesting here is the structure of alliances which are embodied. In fact, you wage war on a country and then you encompass that country into your as an ally, so it can't establish allies with other countries. In other words, you had Vietnam, you had Cambodia, you had Indonesia, you had many countries in Africa, Mozambique, Angola, Tanzania, Algeria, and then, of course, in Latin America, Chile, Salvador, Guatemala. All these countries have gone through periods of establishing a national government, a reformist government, with some kind of position or alternative project to global capitalism. But those countries are no longer functional. Okay? They're no longer there. All the social movements have been squashed. They've been replaced by proxy regimes. It's not to say that those movements couldn't reemerge, and they will. They will reemerge in as much as the battle against the hegemonic project will eventually continue. But what is very significant, and the history of warfare tells us that, the First World War, Triple Alliance, Triple Entente, the shifting alliances is fundamental. Already, China is breaking some of its relations with North Korea. It doesn't have the same bilateral links that it had several years back. And at the same time, we must understand that following the bilateral agreement which China and the United States signed in September 2001, following the 9/11 attacks, it was conditional on their entry into the World Trade Organization. They signed a sweeping agreement which allows Western banks to enter into the Chinese banking landscape up to the retail level. And consequently, JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, they're all firmly entrenched in the Chinese banking system. And this is something that many Western countries wouldn't allow. I mean, in Canada, we don't allow foreign banks to enter into our financial system. But in China, they're there. And the question is, will these economic ties, which are far-reaching, will they ultimately lead to a collapse in the geopolitical relationship between Russia and China, namely the fact that China and Russia are together from a strategic military point of view, but in terms of banking, the United States and China are more or less partners. And so that is what I call cross-cutting coalitions. And ultimately, something is going to give in. And if the alliance between China and Russia gives in, we're in a totally different environment. In other words, we are at a very dangerous crossroads in our history. And we also have a certain level of insanity in the formulation and implementation of US foreign policy. And that combined with alliances and cross-cutting alliances could, and it's not to be excluded, lead to the unthinkable, a global third world war and with the use of nuclear weapons, because the United States has already redefined its nuclear doctrine. And that happened in 2002 with a Senate decision that tactical nuclear weapons could be used in the conventional war theater without the green light from the commander-in-chief. We're talking about so-called mini nukes with explosive capacity between 1/3 and 6 times a Hiroshima bomb. So we're in a World War III scenario as we speak. And the problem is that could take place through a so-called mistake or stupidity or paranoia. So all you have to have is some crazy person in the White House who doesn't necessarily abide by what is emanating from the armed forces. The armed forces have a certain sense of sanity, but ultimately it is civilians that will press the button of a World War III.
Well, I'm pretty sure we'll have a crazy person in the White House next year, no matter who wins the election. So I'm afraid that your analysis will come true in that respect. Well, you draw a very detailed, nuanced, and multivariate picture of the global situation. And for people who want more details of that picture, I will direct them to an article on globalresearch.ca, Neoliberalism and the Globalization of War, America's Hegemonic Project. The link will be in the show notes for this video. Michel Chossudovsky, thank you again for your time today.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be on the program.
The Corbett Report is brought to you by you. Your support makes the Corbett Report